Jessica Drake had never thought of her grandfather's farm as a business or an investment. It had always been a living thing to her, an inheritance that breathed and remembered. When she took it over after his passing, she didn't modernize it much. She replaced the old fencing, painted the barn a muted red, and repaired the irrigation lines herself with sunburned hands and quiet pride. The property sat low in a small valley in Oregon, where the grass grew thick and wet with morning fog, and the scent of soil clung to everything. Life there was measured not by hours, but by the weather. The way light spilled across the fields in the early hours, or how the rain came down in long, melodic sheets that muffled the world until it felt like time itself paused. Jessica was not a recluse, but she valued quiet. Her neighbors were a good 10-minute drive away, and that distance had always suited her. The closest one, Karen Abbott, lived on the opposite slope, in a newly built modern house that looked like it had been imported straight from a design magazine. Karen was friendly in the way people with money often were, loud, smiling, and impossible to ignore. Their first few encounters were polite, if slightly strained. Karen had a habit of turning casual conversation into subtle competition, whose fence looked better, whose garden bloomed first, whose life seemed more in order. Jessica didn't play along. She had her animals, her small vegetable plots, her dog Tucker, and the satisfaction of keeping things running without asking anyone for help. It was enough. Early in the summer, things began to shift in a way she didn't quite notice at first. She started receiving odd phone calls, vendors offering catering services, photographers asking about venue availability, and one message from someone congratulating her on joining a preferred location network. Jessica assumed it was spam, maybe some marketing scam targeting landowners. She deleted the emails without reading further. But then, one Friday afternoon, a large truck arrived, white with elegant gold lettering that read Pine Valley Linens. The driver asked her to sign a delivery slip. When she refused, he looked at his clipboard, confused. "Drake Farm, right?" he said, glancing around the property as if he couldn't possibly be mistaken. "Order for Sunday, wedding rental." Jessica laughed at first, thinking he'd mixed up addresses, but when she looked at the invoice, it listed her exact property details, down to the rural parcel number. The driver, apologetic but pressed for time, left the crates stacked neatly by her gate and drove off before she could stop him. When she called the number on the invoice, an automated voice answered, "Thank you for choosing Pine Valley Weddings. Your special day begins with us." That night, Jessica tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe someone else had used her address by mistake. She went out to lock the gate before sunset and froze when she saw a small white wooden sign stuck into the dirt beside the road. In cursive gold letters it read, "Guest parking, Karen Pass Tom." There were champagne corks lying in the grass, still damp from the dew, and faint tracks of tires in the mud leading down toward her barn. She stood there for a long time, the cool evening air tightening her throat, her mind trying to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was preparation. Someone, somewhere, had decided her farm was the perfect backdrop for a wedding that wasn't hers, and the name on that sign told her exactly who had made that decision. The next morning brought a fog so dense it swallowed the fence posts and turned the valley into a white ocean, and yet even that soft stillness couldn't disguise the mechanical clatter coming from the lower field. Jessica stepped onto her porch, still wearing her flannel shirt from the night before, the dog pacing nervously at her feet. Down by the barn, figures moved through the mist, 3 men unloading folding chairs, another rolling out a length of white carpet along the gravel road. A box truck idled with its hazard lights blinking, and a woman with a clipboard barked instructions over the sound of an electric drill. For a few stunned seconds, Jessica could only watch, unable to process what she was seeing. It looked like an event setup, efficient, deliberate, well-rehearsed. When she finally started toward them, her boots sinking into the wet ground, the workers barely looked up. "Excuse me," she called out, raising her voice over the hum of the generator. "You can't be here. This is private property." The woman with the clipboard turned, smiled tightly, and said, "We were told the owner approved an early arrival for setup. Mrs. Abbott said to start by 9. Jessica stopped in her tracks, rain dripping from her hairline. "Mrs. Abbott," she repeated slowly. "Karen Abbott." The woman nodded, already glancing back at her checklist. "That's right. She said you'd be out this morning to confirm the lighting layout." It was such an absurd sentence that Jessica laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "She doesn't own this property," she said. "I do. You need to pack up and leave. Now." The woman blinked, clearly irritated. "Ma'am, with respect, we have a full contract signed for this venue. If we don't meet our deadline, my company loses the deposit." She gestured vaguely toward the road. "If you have a problem, take it up with the client. We're just hired labor." One of the men nearby called out for an extension cord, and within seconds, the air filled with the rhythmic pounding of tent poles being driven into the earth. Jessica tried again, shouting this time, but they didn't stop. Finally, she pulled out her phone and called the local sheriff's department. The dispatcher sounded sympathetic, but non-committal. "If it's a civil matter, ma'am, we can't intervene unless there's property damage or violence. Try to resolve it peacefully," the voice advised. "You might also want to contact whoever organized the event and ask them to cease operations." Jessica hung up, numb with disbelief. By noon, the field was almost unrecognizable. Rows of white chairs lined the orchard path, a wooden arch wrapped in silk flowers framed the pond, and caterers were unloading boxes from another truck that had just arrived. Someone had even strung lights between the trees, delicate bulbs swaying in the breeze. It looked like something out of a magazine, beautiful, invasive, surreal. And at the center of it all stood Karen Abbott, wearing pastel rain boots and holding a steaming cup of coffee as though she was supervising her own backyard. Jessica approached her slowly, heart pounding, trying to suppress the surge of anger building in her chest. Karen turned, all charm and nonchalance. "Jess, oh good, you're here. I was worried the fog might have kept you inside." Jessica didn't return the smile. "What the hell is this?" she demanded. Karen blinked innocently. "Oh, come on. It's just one little event. Everything will be gone by Monday morning. You won't even notice we were here." Jessica stared at her. "You broke my lock. You brought strangers onto my land, and you're setting up a wedding on my property without permission. That's not a little event. That's trespassing." For a moment, Karen's expression faltered, then quickly reset into something placid and dismissive. "Don't be dramatic, Jess. I told you weeks ago I was looking for a rustic venue. You said you didn't rent your space, but you never said I couldn't use it for a day. It's all in good spirit. Think of it as, what do they call it? Community cooperation." Jessica's throat went dry. "I said no," she said slowly. "I said this land isn't for rent. That's not cooperation. That's theft." Karen sighed as if exhausted by someone else's immaturity. "Look, I've already paid deposits, and the guests are coming in from out of state. If I cancel now, it'll ruin everything. You don't want to be the villain here, do you? Everyone's been looking forward to this for months." Jessica could barely hear her over the roaring in her ears. "You didn't even ask," she said. "You just decided." Karen tilted her head. "You're overreacting. Besides, it's not like this place is booked or anything. You should be flattered. Your farm's going to be the most photographed spot in the county after this weekend." The condescension hit harder than any insult. Jessica turned and walked away, shaking, half afraid of what she might say if she stayed another second. By the time she reached the house, she could already hear laughter echoing faintly through the mist, workers joking, music testing through portable speakers. She locked herself inside and sat at the kitchen table, her phone still in her hand, considering her next call. The sheriff had been useless. Maybe she could get a restraining order. Maybe she should start by finding proof that none of this had been authorized. When she stepped outside again an hour later, a catering van was parked under her oak tree and someone had hung a sign reading ceremony entrance. Her fields, her soil, her private refuge, every inch now felt claimed by strangers. She wanted to scream. Instead, she reached down, grabbed the sign, and snapped it in half. Karen's voice drifted from across the field, sweet as poison. "Oh dear, don't break that. It's rented." Jessica stood there, trembling, soaked in drizzle, her dog barking furiously beside her. It was in that moment she understood that this wouldn't end with polite words or half measures. Karen Abbott wasn't just an inconsiderate neighbor. She was something far worse, a person who believed rules applied to everyone but her. And the realization came with a cold, cutting certainty. If Jessica didn't stop her now, she'd never get her farm back. By Saturday afternoon, the farm no longer looked like Jessica's at all. The gravel road that once curved quietly through her pasture had become a procession route, lined with fluttering ribbons and pastel lanterns that swayed in the damp air. Cars began arriving one after another, sleek sedans, rented limousines, SUVs caked with mud from the previous night's rain. Drivers honked impatiently when they were told to park farther down the slope, and Jessica, watching from the edge of her porch, could feel the ground vibrating from the weight of so many wheels pressing into the wet soil. It wasn't supposed to happen, she kept thinking. Not here, not like this. She had called the sheriff again that morning, but the deputy on duty had said the same thing. Unless there was an explicit order of trespass or property damage, it was a civil disagreement. Civil? There was nothing civil about it. By the time she stepped outside, the ceremony was already in motion. Strangers wandered her land carrying bouquets, adjusting the hem of dresses, shouting instructions into walkie-talkies. The white canopy tents rose against the darkening sky like ghosts, each one strung with lights that glowed a soft gold. Someone had even set up a temporary bar near her barn, and a man in a black vest was pouring champagne into rows of glasses, as if he owned the place. Jessica walked toward them, her boots sinking deeper into the softened ground, and was immediately intercepted by a young woman in a headset. "Hi, are you with the Abbott party?" she chirped brightly. Jessica's voice came out sharper than intended. "I'm the owner of this land, and no one was authorized to be here." The girl blinked, clearly taken aback. "Oh, okay, I'll get Mrs. Abbott." Before Jessica could stop her, the woman was already gone, vanishing into the crowd of pastel dresses and umbrellas. The music started soon after, a slow, sugary melody played through large speakers that made the barn walls tremble. Guests cheered as Karen emerged from behind the tent, wearing a designer gown that shimmered even under the dull gray light. She looked radiant and unbothered, as though she hadn't spent the last 2 days turning someone else's property into her stage. When her eyes met Jessica's across the field, she smiled. A calm, confident smile that said she had already won. It wasn't defiance. It was ownership. That expression hollowed something inside Jessica, left a cold space where fury started to pool. The ceremony unfolded under thickening clouds. The pastor's voice rose and fell with the wind. Guests clapped, cameras flashed, and for a brief, eerie moment, the whole valley felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Then the sky broke open. The first drop of rain struck Jessica's shoulder, heavy and cold. Within seconds it became a downpour, sheets of water hammering against the tents, collapsing the thin canvas walls inward. People screamed, scattering for cover. The white carpet dissolved into brown mud. A table flipped in the wind, sending glasses shattering across the field. Jessica ran toward the barn, shouting for people to move away from the low areas. She knew how quickly the runoff from the hills could flood the valley floor, but her warnings were drowned out by music and panic. Karen, soaked but still clinging to her bouquet, shouted at one of the caterers to save the cake. Someone slipped, fell, and the sound of tearing fabric mixed with the metallic groan of a tent pole snapping in two. Water rushed down the slope, pooling near the pond where several guests were trying to retrieve their belongings. Jessica grabbed a shovel from the side of the barn and began clearing a path for drainage, her boots sinking ankle-deep in muck. She didn't think about whose fault it was anymore, just about keeping people from getting hurt. The storm lasted only half an hour, but when it passed, the damage was catastrophic. The orchard lawn looked like a battlefield. Flowers floated face down in puddles. The arch had collapsed sideways into the mud, and her irrigation lines had been torn apart by car tires trying to leave the property in panic. The once green pasture was now a churned wasteland of ruts and broken stakes. The last guests departed around dusk, leaving behind silence and a trail of destruction that stretched from her gate to the pond. Carolyn was among the last to go. She stood by her car, wrapped in a soaked shawl, staring at the mess with a tight, unreadable expression. When she saw Jessica watching her, she approached, her heels squelching in the mud. "I'll have it cleaned up," she said coolly. "You don't need to overreact." Jessica let out a bitter laugh. "Overreact? You turned my home into a swamp." Karen's tone hardened. "You could have helped instead of standing around playing the victim. Everyone saw you yelling during the ceremony. You embarrassed yourself." She opened the car door, her movements sharp. "And don't worry about the damage. My people will handle it." Then she drove off, leaving twin trenches carved by her tires in the wet earth. Jessica stood there long after the taillights disappeared. The rain had stopped, but the water still trickled from the fields, carrying soil and debris toward the lower ditch. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Thick, heavy, accusatory. Tucker barked once from the porch, and Jessica turned toward the house, soaked and trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper, a hollow ache that sat between disbelief and fury. She spent the night cleaning what she could, gathering torn ribbons, righting fallen chairs, draining flooded trenches, but every step reminded her of what she had lost. It wasn't just the land. It was control, ownership, dignity. The next morning, she found the first envelope lying on her doorstep, sealed in plastic to protect it from the rain. It was from a law firm in Portland, elegant and impersonal. The letter inside was brief but devastating. "Notice of legal action. You are listed as the property owner and event host for the wedding held on June 14th. Multiple attendees have filed claims for injury and damages sustained on your premises. Please respond within 10 business days." Jessica stared at the words until they blurred, the paper trembling in her hands. The guests weren't suing Karen. They were suing her. The letter felt heavier than paper had any right to be. Jessica sat at the kitchen table staring at it for what might have been an hour, her coffee long gone cold, the ticking of the old wall clock marking each second of disbelief. The document named her as the event coordinator and landholder, an absurd combination of titles that made her sound like she had orchestrated the entire debacle herself. Each claim was written in sterile legal phrasing, the kind of language that made even truth sound negotiable. One woman demanded compensation for emotional distress caused by unsafe terrain. Another claimed a sprained wrist after slipping on an improperly maintained pathway. Someone else accused her of negligence for not providing emergency lighting when the storm hit. Nowhere in the entire stack of allegations was Karen's name mentioned. The realization hit Jessica with slow, suffocating clarity. Somehow, Karen had erased herself from the paperwork. She called the number listed on the letterhead, but the receptionist refused to give any information beyond confirming that, yes, Jessica Drake was being held responsible. By Monday morning, she had found a small local law firm in town willing to meet her. The attorney, a middle-aged man named Paul Eckhart, listened quietly as she explained everything: how Karen had organized the event, the unauthorized setup, the flood, the chaos. He made notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking for clarification. When she was finished, he leaned back and steepled his fingers. "Do you have anything in writing that says she didn't have permission to use your property?" Jessica frowned. "No, because I never thought I'd need to. It was just understood." Eckhart sighed, not unkindly. "The problem is, if she represented herself as the renter or event coordinator, and vendors or guests relied on that representation, then legally they can pursue whoever owns the land for damages. You can countersue her, but first we have to prove you weren't involved." "How?" Jessica asked, frustration rising. "Everyone saw me trying to stop it. I called the sheriff. I told them to leave." He nodded. "That helps. But we'll need more. Emails, invoices, anything that connects the contracts to her. People like Mrs. Abbott rarely do these things alone. There'll be a paper trail." He paused, studying her expression. "Has she reached out since the event?" Jessica shook her head. "She texted once, said she'd take care of everything." "That was before I got this." Eckhart's eyes narrowed slightly. "Forward that to me. And Jessica, don't contact her directly again. Let me handle it." Over the next few days, Jessica sank into a rhythm of damage control. Between feeding the animals and repairing the torn irrigation lines, she spent hours gathering receipts, phone logs, and photos of the property after the storm. Every snapshot felt like evidence not just of the flood, but of a violation deeper than mud and broken glass. The land looked wounded, the soil torn open and bruised. Neighbors began whispering. She could feel it in the polite silences at the feed store, the awkward glances when she passed by. Someone must have told them about the lawsuits. Small towns never stayed quiet for long. On Wednesday, Eckhart called with news. "We found something," he said, and for the first time there was a spark of energy in his voice. Karen didn't use her own name on the rental contracts. She listed the business as Drake Meadows Event Property. Jessica froze. "That's my name." "Exactly. She created a booking profile online using your property address and some old photos that must have been taken from real estate listings. The vendors and guests booked everything through a third-party platform. Payment was processed digitally." "So she faked a company?" "More like borrowed your identity to make it look legitimate. The kicker is, the payments went to an account that's already been closed. Cash withdrawals. No trace. Smart in a sloppy kind of way." Jessica's stomach twisted. "Can we prove it was her?" "Working on it. I've subpoenaed the service provider for IP logs and access records. If she used her own connection, we'll have her." That night, Jessica barely slept. She lay awake listening to the distant hum of frogs by the pond, the rhythmic creak of the windmill turning in the dark. The idea that Karen had built an entire fake business around her farm felt too calculated to be spontaneous. It meant planning. It meant intent. By morning, she was running on adrenaline. She drove into town to meet Eckhart again, and he showed her a printed document retrieved from the booking system, a digital contract signed with an electronic signature that read J. Drake. The time stamp was from 2 months earlier. Jessica stared at the looping scrawl. "That's not mine." "I know," he said, "but here's the clever part. She didn't forge your name by hand. The system automatically signs using whatever authorization is linked to the account. She used a Facebook login to authenticate." Jessica blinked. "What?" "Think back. Did she ever have access to your social media? Maybe a shared device?" The memory came rushing back like ice water. The afternoon Karen had stopped by under the pretense of asking her to like a local community page for exposure. She had handed Jessica her phone, logged into Facebook, and asked her to open the event link from your account. It gets more engagement that way. Jessica had thought nothing of it. She used my login, she whispered. She must have saved the authorization. Eckhart nodded grimly. That's our link. Once we have the metadata, we can tie it directly to her IP. It's not ironclad yet, but it's strong. She committed digital impersonation. For the first time in weeks, Jessica felt something close to relief, though it was a fragile, trembling thing. So this means I can clear my name. Eventually, he said. But there's still the matter of the claims. Until a judge rules otherwise, you're technically liable. I can file for a stay, but it might take months. Jessica left his office feeling as if she'd been both rescued and condemned. The road home seemed longer than usual, the sky heavy with unspent rain. When she reached the farm, a fresh envelope was taped to her gate. This one wasn't from lawyers. It was from the county assessor's office, notifying her that a commercial use inquiry had been filed against her property, triggered by reports of unpermitted event hosting. Someone, she didn't need to guess who, had turned her in for violating zoning laws. That night she sat at her desk surrounded by paperwork, each document like a splinter digging deeper under her skin. Karen wasn't just protecting herself, she was building a story where Jessica was the villain. And the more Jessica tried to prove her innocence, the guiltier she looked on paper. The absurdity of it all almost made her laugh. Outside, the field still smelled faintly of rain and trampled grass. The air carried a sweetness that reminded her of how the place used to feel before all of this. Safe, unassuming, hers. Now, every creak of the barn or distant car engine sent her heart racing. She wasn't imagining it. The war had turned silent, bureaucratic, but no less brutal. It wasn't about the wedding anymore. It was about ownership, control, the slow suffocation of truth under paperwork and plausible deniability. Somewhere up on the ridge, in that pristine glass-walled house, Karen Abbott was likely sipping wine and rehearsing her innocence, confident that Jessica's quiet nature would bury her long before any court could. But Jessica wasn't quiet anymore. The farm that had once taught her patience was now teaching her resistance. She swore, silently, that if Karen wanted a fight built on lies, then Jessica would bring her down with nothing but the truth, and the kind of persistence that outlasted storms. By the end of the following week, Jessica's world had shrunk to the boundaries of her property and the constant hum of her phone. Every day brought something new. Another letter, another notice, another reminder that Karen Abbott's reach was not just social, but systemic. One morning, a county inspector appeared unannounced, his truck grinding to a stop by the gate. He wore a reflective vest and an apologetic expression, explaining that he was there to follow up on reports of commercial misuse. Jessica watched him step onto the gravel path, clipboard in hand, while she stood frozen on the porch. "You've been reported for unlicensed event hosting," he said gently, as if she were a child who didn't understand her own mistake. "It's probably a misunderstanding, but we have to document it. Someone submitted photos of a large gathering here." Jessica wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but instead she gestured toward the sodden field, the broken chairs still piled near the barn. "You're standing in the misunderstanding," she said. The man sighed, scribbled a few notes, and promised to file an initial observation. She knew what that meant. Paperwork that would sit in an office for weeks, feeding the same machine that was slowly devouring her sanity. When he left, she found a single white envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant. Inside was a folded card that smelled faintly of perfume. It didn't have to be this way. You made it ugly. There was no signature, but she didn't need one. The next day, Paul Eckhart called to tell her the digital subpoena had come through. "We have confirmation," he said. "The booking profile was created from Karen Abbott's home network. Her IP address matches the login history of your account." Jessica gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. "So that's it. We can prove it was her." "Almost. We'll need to present it formally, and her attorney will stall as long as possible. But this is solid evidence. It puts her in the frame." For the first time, Jessica felt a flicker of triumph, but it was short-lived. That evening, just as the light began to fade, she heard an engine outside. A dark SUV idled by her mailbox, its headlights cutting through the dusk. When she stepped onto the porch, the vehicle rolled away slowly, disappearing around the bend. An hour later, her power went out. The whole house sank into darkness, the refrigerator clicking silent, the hum of the water pump dying mid-cycle. Jessica took a flashlight and stepped outside. The air smelled faintly of ozone and rain, but the storm hadn't yet broken. At the end of the driveway, the power line hung slack, severed cleanly where it met the pole. Someone had cut it. Not an accident, not weather, clean and deliberate. The electric company confirmed that there had been no scheduled maintenance, and they couldn't send a crew until morning. Jessica spent that night in candlelight, the shadows long and restless against the walls. She could hear every creak of the house, every rustle from the fields. Her dog refused to leave her side. By dawn, exhaustion had blurred into something colder than fear. She called Eckhart again, voice hoarse. "She's not just trying to win in court," Jessica said. "She's trying to break me." Eckhart didn't disagree. "Stay alert," he told her. "Document everything." Over the next days, strange things began to happen. A delivery truck arrived with a pallet of fertilizer she hadn't ordered. Her online banking app flagged several failed login attempts from an unknown device. A local paper ran a brief story about a farm under investigation for illegal event activity, quoting unnamed sources who described her as uncooperative. It didn't take much imagination to guess who had fed them that story. Karen was tightening the net. Not through open confrontation, but through erosion, the slow wearing down of trust, reputation, and safety. On the fourth night, a storm rolled in, fierce and unrelenting. The power flickered again, but this time it wasn't the wires. It was the transformer, overloaded from the downpour. The fields flooded for the second time that month. Jessica waded through knee-deep water to close the barn doors, her flashlight beam trembling across the slick mud. As she turned back toward the house, she saw movement near the fence line. A figure, small but distinct, standing still in the rain. She froze, the beam of light trembling across the darkness. The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it turned and walked away toward the road. By the time she reached the gate, it was gone, but something white fluttered from the post. Another note, rain-soaked and smeared. "You should have just said yes." The next morning, she drove to the sheriff's office herself. She demanded to file a harassment report, laying out everything: the impersonation, the vandalism, the power cut, the letters. The deputy took her statement with professional detachment, though his eyes flickered uneasily when she mentioned Karen's name. "We can't prove who did any of that," he said finally. "But we'll keep an eye out." Jessica almost laughed. "An eye out? That's all?" He looked apologetic. "People like her. They have influence here. My advice? Keep things documented. Stay calm, and let your lawyer handle it." When she returned home, her gate had been spray-painted with 2 words in dripping black. "No welcome." She stood there in the midday heat, the smell of paint stinging her nose, and for a long time she didn't move. Something inside her, something soft, forgiving, finally cracked. She cleaned the gate, replaced the locks, installed motion sensors and cameras, even though she hated the feeling of surveillance. It wasn't about paranoia anymore. It was survival. That night, as the fields shimmered silver under the moonlight, Jessica realized Karen had underestimated her. Fear was a temporary weapon. Resolve was not. The war Karen had started with charm and deceit would end with exposure. And if the courts weren't fast enough, Jessica would find her own way to make the truth visible, one piece at a time, until Karen Abbott's entire polished world collapsed under the weight of what she'd done. The hearing was held in a sterile courtroom that smelled faintly of polish and recycled air, the kind of place where truth felt like something negotiated rather than spoken. Jessica sat at the plaintiff's table beside Eckhart, her palms slick with sweat despite the cold. Across the aisle, Karen Abbott looked immaculate, dressed in pale blue, her hair perfectly smoothed, her posture serene. It was as if she were attending a luncheon rather than a proceeding that could strip her reputation bare. The first hour passed in procedural drudgery, statements of claim, objections, motions, but Jessica barely heard them. Her attention fixed on the faint smile tugging at Karen's lips, the same one she had worn that day by the pond when everything fell apart. When Eckhart finally stood to present the digital evidence, the courtroom changed temperature. He projected the report onto the screen, a list of timestamps and IP addresses that glowed in sterile monochrome. Each login, he explained, originated from the defendant's home network, including the session that created the fraudulent business profile, Drake Meadows Event Property. The authentication key came from an active Facebook token tied to my client's account, accessed from a device registered under the name Karen Abbott. The judge adjusted his glasses, expression unreadable. Karen's lawyer objected, claiming the records were incomplete, that Wi-Fi connections are public and data can be misleading. Eckhart countered with calm precision, showing the purchase logs, identical to Karen's personal billing address and the archived messages between her and the vendors, all signed digitally within minutes of the same IP activity. A murmur rippled through the small audience of local reporters and curious neighbors. Jessica felt her pulse hammer in her throat. For the first time, Karen's composure wavered. Her hands shifted, folding and unfolding on the table. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't look at Jessica. "I made an honest mistake," she said, her voice a smooth tremor. "The website auto-filled the name when I searched for venues. I assumed Jessica was aware. I thought she was simply hesitant about paperwork. If I'd known she objected, I never would have gone through with it." Eckhart's tone was almost surgical when he responded. "You authorized vendors, accepted payments, and filed insurance claims using her name. You also filed an anonymous complaint to the county about commercial misuse, a complaint that could only have been made by someone with intimate knowledge of the incident. Would you like to explain that coincidence?" Karen's eyes flickered toward him, then away. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to feel its weight. Finally, she said, "My lawyer advised me not to answer hypothetical questions." The judge's gavel struck once, a dull echo against the walls. "That won't be necessary," he said. "We have enough on record." The ruling came just before noon. The court found Karen Abbott liable for unauthorized commercial activity, fraud, and defamation. All claims against Jessica Drake were dismissed. Damages were awarded to cover repairs, legal fees, and the mental distress caused by the impersonation. As the decision was read aloud, Jessica didn't feel triumphant. She felt emptied, like a storm had passed through her and left silence in its wake. Karen stood motionless as the judge finished speaking. Only when the clerk began collecting documents did she move, turning slowly toward Jessica with an expression that was neither anger nor regret, but disbelief. The disbelief of someone who had never considered losing possible. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Eckhart touched Jessica's arm lightly, guiding her toward the door. Outside, the air was warm and sharp with the scent of asphalt and new rain. Reporters waited near the steps, but Jessica didn't stop. She walked past them into the sunlight, her boots clicking against the stone, her breath finally steady. For months, she had lived under the shadow of someone else's arrogance, and now that shadow had lifted. But freedom, she realized, didn't feel like celebration. It felt like exhaustion. Behind her, she heard Karen's voice rise faintly, arguing with her lawyer, the calm veneer fracturing into something brittle and frantic. Jessica didn't turn back. The courthouse doors closed, muffling the sound. The war was over, but the damage had already been written into the soil of her land and the lines of her face. Some things, she knew, would never wash clean again. Weeks passed before the noise around the case began to fade, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost unnatural. The farm was quiet again, the fields slowly healing under the early autumn sun, though the scars of the flood remained visible in the uneven soil and the faint stains along the barn walls. Jessica spent her days repairing fences, replanting grass, and trying not to think about lawyers or courtrooms. At first, every car that slowed near her driveway made her tense. Every unfamiliar sound felt like a threat waiting to return, but the silence held. The only letters she received now were from people who had followed the story, farmers, small business owners, strangers who had written to say they understood what it was like to have their lives twisted by someone else's entitlement. She answered only a few, but she kept them all. One afternoon, as the light thinned into gold, she walked down to the pond where the wedding had taken place. The ground was firm again, the water calm, reflecting the soft blue of the sky. A few ribbons still clung to the reeds, faded almost white by the sun, and she left them there. They belonged to the past now, reminders of how fragile ownership could be when trust was misplaced. She thought of Karen sometimes, not with hatred, but with a kind of detached curiosity, as if the woman belonged to another world entirely. The local paper had reported that Karen's company was dissolving under the weight of debt and lawsuits from the vendors she had deceived. Rumor had it she had left the valley, though no one seemed to know where. Jessica didn't care to find out. There was a strange peace in not needing an ending beyond her own. As the wind moved gently through the grass, she felt the farm settle around her again, not as a place of battle, but as something restored, its quiet dignity returned. She realized she didn't want to erase what had happened. It was part of the land's memory now, as much as her grandfather's laughter or the smell of the harvest. She walked back toward the house, the sun dipping low behind the hills, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't look over her shoulder. The fields no longer felt invaded. They felt earned.